For 3 years, I'd been walking on eggshells around David. The slaps started small. A quick backhand when dinner was cold. A shove when I disagreed with him. Always behind closed doors. Always followed by apologies and promises it would never happen again. His mother had been visiting for the weekend, and I'd been trying so hard to be the perfect wife. Margaret Morrison was everything I wasn't. Polished, educated, from old money that traced back to the founding families of our small southern town. She'd made it clear from the beginning that I wasn't good enough for her son, the girl from the wrong side of town who trapped her precious boy with an unplanned pregnancy that we lost 3 months into our marriage. Margaret had this way of making me feel small without saying anything directly cruel. She'd run her finger along surfaces looking for dust, suggest better brands of cleaning products with subtle disdain, or mention casually how David's ex-girlfriend had been such a wonderful cook and had come from such a good family. Every interaction felt like a test I was failing. Every conversation a reminder of my inadequacies. I made her favorite meals all weekend. Cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off, Earl Grey tea served at exactly the right temperature, beef Wellington that took me 6 hours to prepare correctly. I cleaned the house twice, vacuuming carpets that didn't need vacuuming and polishing silver that was already spotless. I bit my tongue when she criticized everything from my cooking to my outfit choices to the way I arranged flowers in the guest room. She had this way of looking at me like I was a stain on her expensive furniture, something unsightly that needed to be dealt with but was too distasteful to address directly. Her disapproval was a living thing that filled every room she entered. The explosion came over something stupid, as these things always did. I'd accidentally used the good china for lunch instead of saving it for dinner. It was an honest mistake. I'd been so nervous about impressing her that my hands were shaking as I set the table, and I grabbed the wrong plates from the cabinet. The Haviland porcelain with the delicate blue roses that had belonged to David's grandmother, each piece worth more than I made in a week at the bookstore where I worked part-time. David's face went red the moment he saw the delicate porcelain, the vein in his temple starting to throb the way it always did when his anger began building. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous in the way that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "I specifically told you those were for tonight when the Hendersons come over. Those plates are worth more than you make in a month." "I'm sorry," I whispered, already reaching to clear the table with shaking hands, careful not to let the precious china clink together. "I'll wash them carefully and reset everything with the everyday dishes. I promise I'll be more careful next time." His mother was sitting right there, sipping her tea from one of the precious cups like nothing was happening, her perfectly applied lipstick leaving no mark on the rim. I thought maybe her presence would keep him calm. Maybe he wouldn't dare show his true nature in front of the woman whose opinion mattered more to him than anything else in the world, including his wife's safety. I'd never been more wrong about anything in my life. David grabbed my wrist so hard I felt the bones grind together, his fingers wrapping completely around my narrow arm. "You never listen, do you? You're too stupid to follow simple instructions. How many times do I have to explain things before they penetrate that thick skull of yours?" The familiar panic started rising in my chest like floodwater. This was how it always began. The insults designed to make me feel worthless. The grip that would leave purple fingerprints for days. The way he made me feel like everything wrong in his life was somehow my fault. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened until tears sprang to my eyes. The delicate bones in my wrist felt like they might snap under the pressure. "Please," I said quietly, glancing nervously at his mother, hoping she might intervene. "You're hurting me." His mother continued drinking her tea, her face completely expressionless, like she was watching a mildly interesting television program. No help was coming from that direction. She'd probably blame me for embarrassing her son, for creating drama during her visit, for being the kind of woman who drove men to violence through her own inadequacy. That's when he did it, right in front of his mother. Right in the middle of their pristine dining room with its crystal chandelier and mahogany table that had been in the family for generations, he drew back his hand and slapped me across the face so hard my ears rang and I tasted blood. The impact sent me stumbling backward into the antique sideboard, my hip connecting with its sharp edge. A crystal vase filled with fresh roses wobbled dangerously before I caught it with my free hand, adding insult to injury. Now I was the clumsy wife who couldn't even get hit properly without threatening more precious family heirlooms. I stood there stunned, my cheek burning like someone had pressed a hot iron against my skin, waiting for his mother to gasp or object or do something. Anything. She'd always been so proper, so concerned with appearances and social etiquette, and maintaining the family's reputation in the community. Surely domestic violence in her dining room would cross some line, would violate her sense of propriety if nothing else. Instead, she set down her teacup with a delicate clink and looked directly at her son. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence like a bell tolling the hour. "David Anthony Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "What did you just do?" Something in her tone made David freeze completely, his hand still raised from the slap. It wasn't the voice of a shocked mother-in-law. It wasn't surprise or horror or dismay. It was something else entirely, something that carried the weight of absolute authority and years of accumulated knowledge about the kind of man her son really was. The same tone that had probably terrified him as a child when he'd broken something valuable or tracked mud through her pristine house. The voice of consequences approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. He stammered, trying to form words, but she held up one perfectly manicured finger. The gesture was small, but somehow commanding, like she was conducting an orchestra and had just called for complete silence. "I asked you a question," she continued, her voice perfectly calm. "What did you just do to your wife?" David's face went white, then red, then white again, like someone was adjusting the color balance on an old television. I could see him scrambling for an excuse, Some way to minimize what had just happened. Some way to make this my fault. Like he always did. Some way to convince his mother that I deserved it. That any reasonable man would have done the same thing. She was being disrespectful, he said weakly, his voice cracking slightly like a teenager's. She needs to learn to follow instructions. You know how careless she is with nice things. She never thinks before she acts. She's always breaking something or making mistakes. His mother stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot in a cathedral. She was a small woman, barely 5'4" in her sensible heels, but somehow she seemed to fill the entire space with her presence. The look on her face was something I'd never seen before, and I'd known her for 3 years. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more dangerous. Something calculated and predatory that made David take an actual step backward, bumping into the wall behind him like a cornered animal. "Sit down," she commanded. And David actually obeyed, dropping into his chair like a scolded child. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Margaret walked over to me with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. For a moment, I thought she was going to slap me too, finish what her son had started. Tell me I deserved it for being clumsy with her precious china, for embarrassing her son in front of her, for being the kind of woman who drove men to violence through her own stupidity and carelessness. Instead, she gently took my chin in her perfectly manicured hand and tilted my face toward the light streaming through the bay window. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, like she was examining a piece of damaged artwork that might be restored with enough care and patience. The red handprint was already darkening into a bruise that would last for weeks, and my lip had split where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. I could taste copper and feel my pulse throbbing in the swollen tissue. "How long?" she asked quietly, her eyes never leaving my injured face. "I don't understand," I whispered, confused by her sudden gentleness, by the way she was looking at me like she actually cared what happened to me. "How long has my son been hitting you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, heavy and suffocating. I could feel David's eyes boring into me from across the room, silently threatening what would happen later if I told the truth. The familiar fear crept up my spine like ice water. The fear that had kept me silent for 3 years. The fear that had convinced me to stay in a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit. He doesn't. This was just, I stumbled over the words, the lies coming automatically after years of practice. "Don't lie to me," she said, still speaking quietly but with steel underneath every word. "I've been watching you for 3 years. I know what fear looks like on a woman's face. I know what careful movements look like, what forced smiles look like, what it means when someone flinches every time a door slams or a voice is raised." She turned to face David, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "3 years ago, you came home from your honeymoon with a black eye. You said you walked into a door during your sunset cruise, hit your face on a low beam when the boat rocked. I knew you were lying, but I thought maybe she had hit you. I was almost proud that you'd married someone with enough backbone to fight back." David's mouth fell open, his face cycling through expressions of shock, denial, and growing panic. "Mom, I raised you better than this," she continued, her voice getting stronger with each word, building like a storm-gathering force. "I raised you to protect women, not terrorize them. I raised you to be a man of honor, not a coward who uses his size to intimidate someone smaller and weaker. Your father may have been a bastard in many ways, but he never once laid a hand on me or you children in anger. He had his faults. God knows he had plenty of them. But he wasn't a coward. That wasn't entirely true, and we all knew it. I'd heard whispered stories from David's sister about their father's rages, the holes punched in walls during business disappointments, the way their mother would wear long sleeves in summer and makeup that was just a little too heavy around her eyes after particularly bad fights. But apparently Margaret had decided to rewrite history, or maybe she'd convinced herself that emotional abuse and intimidation didn't count as real violence. She walked to her purse, an expensive leather bag that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and pulled out her phone. The latest model, of course, in a case that matched her outfit perfectly and probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. "What are you doing?" David asked, panic creeping into his voice for the first time since I'd known him. His face had gone completely white, and I could see a vein pulsing frantically in his temple. "I'm calling your sister, Catherine, and then I'm calling the police." The room went dead silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of my own heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped singing. David stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. "You can't do that," he said, his voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before, cracking like an adolescent boy's. "This is between me and my wife. It's none of your business what happens in my marriage. You can't interfere with our private affairs." Margaret looked at him with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your shoe after walking through a particularly unsavory part of town. "Everything you do is my business when you're doing it wrong," she said with deadly calm. "I didn't spend 30 years building this family's reputation in this town, serving on charity boards and hosting fundraisers and being a pillar of the community, to have you destroy it all by beating your wife like some common thug from the trailer park." I realized then that she wasn't defending me out of compassion or moral outrage or any noble desire to protect the innocent. She was protecting the family name, the carefully cultivated image of respectability that came with being Morrisons, in this small southern town, where everyone knew everyone else's business and reputation was everything. But I didn't care about her motives. For the first time in 3 years, someone was standing between me and David's fists, and I didn't care why she was doing it as long as she kept doing it. David tried a different approach, switching to the reasonable voice he used when he was trying to manipulate someone into seeing things his way. The same voice he'd used to convince me that his anger was my fault, that I brought it on myself through my own carelessness and stupidity. "Mom, you don't understand the whole situation," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "She pushes me. She knows exactly what buttons to press to make me angry, exactly how to provoke me. She does things on purpose to get a reaction out of me. Sometimes I just lose control for a second, but she knows how to push me to that point. She's not as innocent as she looks." Margaret held up her hand like she was stopping traffic, her wedding ring catching the light from the chandelier. "I've heard this before," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "From your father, when he tried to explain why he'd put his fist through the kitchen wall. From every weak man who thinks his emotions are someone else's responsibility. From every coward who blames his victim for his own lack of self-control and emotional maturity." She turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her expression was almost kind, almost maternal in a way I'd never experienced from my own mother who died when I was 16. "Pack a bag," she said gently. "You're coming home with me tonight. We'll figure out the rest later." "I can't," I said automatically, the words coming out before I could stop them, programmed by years of David's conditioning. "David needs me to make dinner for the Hendersons. They're coming at 7, and I still have to finish the preparations. The roast is still in the oven, and I haven't made the dessert yet. I have to stay and finish everything. David needs to learn that actions have consequences," she cut me off, her voice brooking no argument. "And you need to remember that you're a human being with value and dignity, not a servant or a punching bag or a piece of property that exists solely for his convenience. The Hendersons can order pizza if they're so concerned about dinner." David stepped forward, his face darkening back to that familiar, dangerous red that always preceded his worst rages. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice dropping to the low growl that had terrified me for 3 years. "She's my wife. We made vows before God and everyone we knew, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. She can't just leave because we had one little argument, one small disagreement." For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Morrison smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered its prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. "Actually," she said, pulling a thick manila folder from her purse like a magician producing a rabbit from a hat, "she's about to be your ex-wife." The folder was thick, stuffed with photographs and documents I'd never seen before, held together with rubber bands and paper clips. Margaret spread them across the mahogany table like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game, where lives hung in the balance. 3 years of documentation," she said calmly, her voice as steady as if she were discussing the weather or her garden club meeting. "Every bruise, every excuse, every time you came to family gatherings and she had mysterious injuries that she blamed on her own clumsiness or accidents. The photographs were devastating, more thorough than anything I could have imagined. Pictures of me at Christmas dinner with finger-shaped bruises on my upper arms, barely visible under the sleeves of my red dress but caught by the camera's flash. Easter brunch with a split lip I'd blamed on tripping over our cat while carrying groceries. My birthday party with a black eye hidden under heavy concealer and strategic lighting, but still noticeable if you knew what to look for. How did you get these?" I whispered, staring at images I didn't even remember being taken, documented evidence of my own suffering that I'd tried so hard to hide. "I hired a private investigator 2 years ago," she said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing hiring a landscaper or a house cleaner. "A very discreet man who specializes in domestic situations. I suspected something was wrong, but I needed concrete proof before I could act. I couldn't base such serious accusations on suspicions and gut feelings alone. The investigator had been thorough in ways that made my head spin. There were medical records from the urgent care clinic where I'd gotten stitches after David pushed me into the coffee table during an argument about his gambling. Bank records showing how my paychecks were being deposited into an account that only David controlled, leaving me with no access to money. Phone records documenting the calls I'd made to my sister, always cut short when David came home early from work. There were photographs taken with telephoto lenses through our windows, showing David grabbing me, shouting at me, backing me into corners with his fist raised. There were audio recordings of our fights, somehow captured through listening devices I'd never known existed. The investigator had interviewed our neighbors, who admitted they'd heard screaming and crashing sounds through our thin walls, but had never called the police because they didn't want to get involved in our private business. He'd talked to my coworkers who confirmed that I often came to work with mysterious injuries and seemed afraid of my husband's reaction to minor mistakes. David lunged for the photos, desperation making him clumsy and uncoordinated, but Margaret was faster despite her age and the restrictive nature of her elegant clothes. She swept them back into the folder and clutched it to her chest like a shield. "You're pathetic," she said to her son, and I'd never heard such pure contempt in a human voice, a weak, pathetic excuse for a man who hurts women to feel powerful because he's too much of a coward to face his real problems. "You're worse than your father ever was. Because at least he had the excuse of growing up poor and desperate during the Depression. You had every advantage in life, education, money, opportunities, and this is what you chose to do with them." That's when David snapped completely. The mask of civilized behavior that he'd worn in front of his mother for his entire life finally cracked and fell away like old paint. He came at her with the same rage I'd seen directed at me so many times before, his hand raised to strike the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, and loved him despite his fundamental flaws. But Margaret Morrison hadn't survived 40 years of marriage to a difficult man and raised 3 children without learning how to defend herself. She stepped aside with surprising grace for a woman in her 60s and brought her knee up hard between his legs. David dropped like a stone, gasping and clutching himself on the polished hardwood floor. His face was purple, and he was making sounds like a wounded animal, curled in a fetal position on the expensive rug his grandmother had brought back from Persia. Margaret straightened her jacket with dignity, smoothed down her skirt, and picked up her phone again. "Now I'm definitely calling the police," she said calmly, stepping over her writhing son like he was debris in her path. The next few hours passed in a blur of uniforms and flashing lights that seemed surreal in the quiet neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. Police sirens wailing through streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns and houses that looked like magazine covers. Statements given in separate rooms while social workers took notes and detectives asked questions I'd never imagined having to answer. Detective Rodriguez was a kind woman with tired eyes who had clearly dealt with situations like mine before. She asked detailed questions in a gentle voice. "How often did he hit you? Did he ever threaten to kill you? Have you ever feared for your life? Did he control your access to money or communication with friends and family? Did he monitor your phone calls or emails? Did he isolate you from your support system?" The answers painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been invisible to everyone except private investigator Margaret had hired. Yes, he controlled all our money. Yes, he had convinced me to cut ties with friends who didn't like him. Yes, he checked my phone and email regularly. Yes, I had been afraid he might kill me during his worst rages. Margaret held my hand through all of it, never once showing emotion beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. When the detective described what the medical examiner would document during my domestic violence examination, her fingers were cool and steady, anchoring me to reality when everything else felt like a nightmare. David was arrested for domestic violence and taken away in handcuffs, while neighbors gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. The great David Morrison, golden boy of the country club set and rising star in his father's law firm, reduced to shouting threats from the back of a police car while his mother watched with cold satisfaction. Later, as we sat in Margaret's pristine living room with its cream-colored furniture and carefully arranged fresh flowers, I finally asked the question that had been eating at me since the moment she'd stood up to her own son. Why now? If you knew what was happening, if you'd been documenting it for 2 years, why didn't you help me before? Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at her perfectly maintained garden where every flower was in its proper place. Then she reached into an antique jewelry box on the side table and pulled out an old photograph, its edges soft with age and handling. The picture showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, smiling at the camera with the radiant joy that only comes with true happiness and hope for the future. She was wearing a wedding dress that must have been beautiful 40 years ago, all lace and seed pearls and dreams of a perfect life with the man she loved. "This is my sister Rebecca," Margaret said quietly, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, vulnerable in a way that made her seem almost human. "She died when she was 26. Her husband beat her to death with a tire iron in their garage while their 2 children slept upstairs in their beds, completely unaware that their mother was dying just below them." I stared at the photograph, my heart racing and my mouth dry. I'd never known David had an aunt, had never heard any stories about Margaret's family beyond the sanitized versions of successful businessmen and charitable work that she shared at dinner parties. "I was supposed to be her maid of honor," Margaret continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph, with the gentleness of someone handling something infinitely precious. "Instead, I was a pallbearer at her funeral 6 years later. I swore that day, standing beside her grave in the rain, that I would never let another woman in my family suffer what she suffered. I would never again fail to act when I saw the signs. But you never liked me," I said, still confused by this revelation. "You always made it clear I wasn't good enough for David. You criticized everything I did, made me feel like I could never measure up to your standards." Margaret sighed, and for the first time she looked every one of her 64 years. "I was trying to protect you in the only way I knew how," she admitted. "I thought if I could convince you to leave on your own, if I could make you see that this family wasn't right for you, you'd be safer. When that didn't work, when I saw that you were just like Rebecca, too loyal, too hopeful, too willing to believe that love could fix everything, I knew I had to take a different approach." She opened another folder, this one even thicker than the first, filled with legal documents and correspondence. I needed enough proof to ensure David would go to prison, not just get a slap on the wrist and court-ordered anger management classes that wouldn't change anything. I needed documentation that would hold up in court, that would convince a judge to keep him away from you permanently. The evidence was overwhelming in its thoroughness and attention to detail. 3 years of careful documentation from multiple sources, building an ironclad case that no defense attorney could overcome. Hospital records going back to our honeymoon, when I'd claimed to have fallen downstairs but the injury pattern suggested I'd been pushed. Police reports from wellness checks that I didn't even know had been made, filed by neighbors who were more concerned than they'd admitted. Testimony from shopkeepers and service workers who had witnessed David's controlling and abusive behavior in public. I had to be absolutely certain, Margaret continued, her voice heavy with the weight of her sister's memory. One chance to get him convicted and imprisoned where he couldn't hurt you anymore. If I'd acted too early with insufficient evidence, he would have learned to be more careful. He would have isolated you completely, moved you away from anyone who might help, and the next time might have been the last time. The divorce proceedings took 8 months of brutal legal warfare that played out in courtrooms and lawyers' offices across the county. Margaret paid for the best family law attorney money could buy, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in domestic violence cases, and had never lost a client to an abusive ex-husband. She was small and fierce and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting women from dangerous men. David tried to contest everything, hiring his own team of expensive lawyers to claim that I was an unfit wife who had driven him to violence through my own incompetence and manipulation. They painted me as a gold digger who had trapped him into marriage and then systematically destroyed his life through my failures as a homemaker and partner. The photographs destroyed their case completely. The medical records destroyed David's credibility with the judge. The testimony from Margaret's private investigator demolished any claim that the abuse was mutual or provoked. The audio recordings revealed David's true nature in ways that no amount of expensive legal representation could overcome. During one particularly devastating session, Patricia played a recording of David threatening to kill me if I ever tried to leave him. His voice clear and unmistakable, promising to hunt me down and make me pay for embarrassing him. The judge's face went white as she listened, and I saw her hands clench into fists. He got 5 years in state prison for aggravated domestic violence, with the possibility of parole in 3 if he completed extensive anger management and psychological counseling. The judge made it clear that any future violations would result in significantly longer sentences. I got the house, substantial alimony that would support me while I rebuilt my life, and a restraining order that would follow him for the rest of his life. Margaret and I never became close friends in the traditional sense, but we developed a complex relationship built on mutual respect and shared trauma. She helped me find a job at her charity foundation, working with other women who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping abusive relationships. I helped her process the guilt she'd carried for 40 years over her sister's death and her failure to recognize the signs in time. On the day David was sentenced, Margaret waited for me outside the courthouse steps. As we watched him being led away in handcuffs for what we hoped would be the final time, his face twisted with rage and shouting promises of revenge that echoed off the courthouse walls, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "Rebecca would have liked you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "You're stronger than either of us gave you credit for. Stronger than she was. And certainly stronger than I was at your age when I had choices to make about my own marriage." 6 months later, I started volunteering at a women's shelter 3 towns over. Far enough away that I felt safe, but close enough to make a real difference. I used my story to help other women recognize the signs of abuse that I had missed or rationalized for so long, to understand that they deserved better than fear and pain disguised as love. I learned that Margaret had been anonymously funding the shelter for years, ever since Rebecca's death, pouring her guilt and grief into helping women escape the fate her sister had suffered. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done, emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Listening to stories that mirrored my own, seeing the same fear and confusion and desperate hope in other women's eyes, helping them navigate the legal system and find safe places to rebuild their lives. But it was also healing, transformative in ways I couldn't have imagined. 1 year after the divorce was final, I received a letter from David in prison. The return address was enough to make my hands shake so violently I almost dropped it, but I forced myself to open it despite every instinct screaming at me to throw it away unread. The letter was 5 pages of carefully crafted manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for leaving him, responsible for his imprisonment, and hopeful that we could somehow reconcile when he was released. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare he'd always been good at. The same techniques that had kept me trapped for 3 years. He wrote about how sorry he was, how much he'd changed through prison counseling and reflection, how he understood now that what he'd done was wrong and would never happen again. He painted himself as a victim of his own emotions, a man who had loved me so much that he'd lost control, but who had learned better ways to express his feelings. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, hitting every button he knew would affect me. References to the good times we'd shared, promises of the life we could have together if I would just give him another chance, subtle threats disguised as expressions of love and devotion. I threw it away without reading past the first paragraph, but I kept the envelope. My therapist had warned me that he would try to contact me eventually, and that I should document any attempts at communication for the police and the parole board. Some apologies come too late. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. Some people never really change, no matter how convincingly they claim otherwise in letters written from prison cells, where they have nothing but time to craft their lies. 2 years later, while volunteering at the shelter, I met Daniel. He was a counselor who worked with male batterers, running court-ordered programs designed to break the cycle of violence before it claimed more victims. He understood trauma and recovery in ways that most people couldn't, and he never once made me feel damaged or broken or responsible for what had happened to me. He was patient with my startled responses and night terrors, the way I flinched when anyone moved too quickly near me, the way I still checked locks multiple times before bed. He understood why I needed space to heal while making it clear that he would wait as long as it took for me to trust again. He never raised his voice, never grabbed my arm to get my attention, never made me feel like I was walking through a minefield of potential triggers. When I had panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds or movements, he would sit quietly nearby until I could breathe normally again, never making me feel broken or difficult. When he asked me to marry him after 2 years of patient courtship, Margaret was the first person I called. "You're sure about this one?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of our shared experience and the knowledge of how badly things could go wrong. "I'm sure," I said, surprised by how certain I felt. "He makes me feel safe in a way I didn't know was possible. He sees my strength instead of trying to break it down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Margaret said, "Good. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve someone who cherishes you instead of diminishing you." At our wedding, which was small and intimate in the garden of the women's shelter where we'd both volunteered, I wore Rebecca's pearl necklace. Margaret had offered it to me as something borrowed, something old. As she fastened the delicate clasp around my neck with trembling fingers, she whispered, "She would have wanted you to have this. She would have wanted you to find happiness after surviving what you survived." The necklace was beautiful, each pearl perfectly matched and lustrous, but more than that, it felt like a blessing from a woman I'd never met, but whose story had saved my life in ways she could never have imagined. David was released from prison that year, his sentence reduced for good behavior and completion of anger management programs that clearly hadn't addressed his fundamental character flaws. He violated his restraining order twice within the first month of his release. Once by showing up at the bookstore where I'd once worked, once by following me to the grocery store where I shopped. Each time, he claimed it was accidental, that he'd just happened to be in the area and hadn't seen me until it was too late to avoid contact. He was calm and reasonable with the police, explaining that he was simply trying to rebuild his life and had no intention of bothering his ex-wife. But I knew better. I recognized the calculated nature of his appearances, the way he positioned himself so I would see him, the subtle smile that said he could reach me whenever he wanted to. It was psychological warfare designed to keep me afraid, to remind me that I would never be completely free of him. The judge wasn't fooled by David's act. She sent him back to prison for another 2 years, with the understanding that any further violations would result in a much longer sentence. Some people, Margaret observed with her characteristic directness, never learn from their mistakes because they don't believe they've made any. Daniel and I have been married for 7 years now, and we have 3 children, twin boys who are 5 and a girl who just turned 3. Sometimes, when one of my sons gets frustrated and his hands clench into fists, I watch him carefully with the vigilance that only a survivor can understand. I teach him to use his words, to walk away when he's angry, to never use his strength to hurt someone smaller than himself. The conversations are age-appropriate but honest. We talk about how it's normal to feel angry sometimes, but that hitting is never okay. We practice deep breathing and counting to 10. We role-play better ways to handle frustration and disappointment. My daughter is fierce and stubborn like Margaret was at that age, with a steel spine and an unwillingness to accept unfair treatment from anyone. When she was just 4, a boy at preschool pushed her off the swing set during an argument over whose turn it was. Instead of crying or running to a teacher, she marched over to him and announced in a clear, carrying voice that hitting wasn't acceptable, and that he needed to apologize and learn better behavior. The teacher later told me it was the most articulate response to bullying she'd ever heard from a preschooler. I felt proud and terrified in equal measure. Proud that my daughter had such strength, terrified that she might someday need it in ways I couldn't protect her from. Margaret is Grandma Maggie to our children, and they adore her completely in the way that children love grandparents who spoil them and have unlimited patience for their questions and games. She takes them to museums and the zoo, teaches them about art and history, and tells them carefully edited stories about their brave mother who escaped from a dragon and found a prince who treated her with kindness. She's never told them that the dragon was her own son, and I hope she never has to. Some family secrets are better left buried, especially when they involve people who are supposed to love and protect you. When my oldest son asked why Daniel isn't my first husband, I told him a simple version of the truth that he could understand at his age. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about who they marry. Sometimes people aren't as kind as they pretend to be. But the important thing is that people can start over and find real love with someone who treats them well. Last month, my daughter asked me about the faint scars on my arms, marks that have faded over the years but never completely disappeared, like shadows of old injuries that serve as permanent reminders of what I survived. I told her that sometimes people we love hurt us, but that doesn't mean we have to keep letting them hurt us. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from someone who claims to love us, but treats us badly. She nodded solemnly, her young mind processing information that no child should ever need to understand. Then she asked if that's why I work at the place where sad ladies come to feel better, why I sometimes get phone calls late at night from women who sound scared and crying. Yes, I told her. That's exactly why. I hope my children never fully understand what those scars really mean, never need to know the details of what their mother endured before they were born. But if any of them ever find themselves in a situation like mine, I hope they remember the lessons I'm trying to teach them now, that they have choices, that they don't have to accept abuse as love, fear as protection, control as care. Margaret Morrison taught me that family isn't just about blood and DNA and shared last names. It's about who shows up when you need them most, who stands between you and danger when the stakes are highest, even when they show up imperfectly, even when their motives aren't entirely pure, even when they wait longer than they should have because they're fighting their own demons and carrying their own guilt. She also taught me that sometimes the person who saves you is the person you least expect, the one who seemed like your enemy but turned out to be your greatest ally. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely source. The mother-in-law who seemed to hate you, the woman who spent 3 years making you feel inadequate and unwelcome but was actually building a case to protect you. 3 weeks ago, Margaret called with news that didn't surprise either of us, but still made my stomach clench with familiar dread. David had been arrested again, this time for assaulting his new girlfriend in a bar parking lot after she tried to break up with him. The girlfriend was 22, barely older than I had been when I married him, with the same frightened look in her eyes that I remembered seeing in mirrors during the worst times. "He'll never change," Margaret said, her voice tired but unsurprised by this latest development. "But at least this time, someone will believe her from the beginning. At least this time, there will be consequences before it goes too far." before he has years to perfect his techniques of control and intimidation. I volunteered to testify at his trial about the pattern of abuse, about what it's like to live in constant fear of someone who claims to love you. The prosecutor says my testimony, combined with Margaret's documentation and the new victim's injuries, should be enough to put him away for a much longer time under the state's repeat offender statutes. Some dragons never stop breathing fire, never learn to control their destructive impulses. But sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we find someone willing to stand between us and the flames. Sometimes that someone is exactly who we'd expect. A friend, a family member, someone who loves us unconditionally. And sometimes, it's the last person we ever imagined would fight for us. The truth about survival isn't that it makes you stronger, though that's what people like to say because it makes them feel better about the terrible things that happen in the world. The truth is that survival makes you more aware of your own strength, strength that was always there, waiting for the right moment and the right person to help you recognize it and use it. Margaret Morrison saw that strength in me before I knew it existed, before I believed I deserved better than what I was getting. And because she did, because she spent years carefully documenting the evidence that would free me, I not only survived, but thrived. Because she stood up to her own son in defense of a daughter-in-law she'd spent 3 years trying to drive away, I got to live. I got to find real love, to have children, to help other women escape their own dragons. Sometimes love looks nothing like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it doesn't come with warm hugs and gentle words and obvious affection. Sometimes it looks like a perfectly dressed mother-in-law calmly gathering evidence while her son destroys his wife piece by piece. Sometimes it looks like 3 years of patient documentation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with devastating effectiveness. Sometimes it looks like a knee to the groin and a phone call to the police. Sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the violence itself. It's discovering who will stand up to stop it, who will risk their own comfort and family relationships to protect someone they barely know but recognize as worthy of protection. Margaret Morrison taught me that heroism doesn't always look heroic, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who understand exactly how much we need saving because they've been there themselves, because they've carried the weight of someone else's death and refused to let it happen again. Today, I'm 32 years old, happily married to a man who has never once made me afraid, raising 3 children who will grow up knowing they deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. I run a non-profit organization that helps domestic violence survivors find housing and legal assistance, funded partly by Margaret's continued donations and partly by grants I've learned to write and fundraise for. Sometimes I look at my life and can barely believe how far I've come from that terrified woman cowering in a pristine dining room, waiting for the next blow to fall. The transformation seems impossible, like something that happened to someone else in a story I once read. But then I touch the faint scars on my arms, or catch sight of Rebecca's pearls in my jewelry box, or watch Margaret teaching my daughter to stand up straight and speak with confidence, and I remember that it's all real. The pain was real, but so was the rescue. The fear was real, but so was the strength I found to walk away when someone finally showed me I had the option. Not everyone gets Margaret Morrison in their life. Not everyone finds someone willing to spend years building an ironclad legal case against their own child. But everyone deserves one, and that's why I do the work I do now. Because sometimes all it takes is one person believing you, one person willing to stand up and say enough, one person who sees your worth when you've forgotten it yourself. Sometimes that person comes from the most unexpected place, at exactly the moment when you've given up hope that anyone will ever help you. Sometimes salvation looks like a slap heard round the world, witnessed by exactly the right person who refuses to let it go unanswered. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that moment changes everything.